the Vedic culture came to an end with the Battle of Kurukshetra, the Bhagavad Gita war, the war that is depicted in the Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna spoke with Krishna on the battlefield. That was about 5,000 years ago. The Vedic knowledge was common within that society, and it was compiled when things started going downhill, when the culture started falling apart and disintegrating. And those are the four Vedas that we have in India. However, the four Vedas are very ceremonial. They're a little bit technical. And there are other, how would you say, branches of the Vedic literature, specifically the Puranas. And the Puranas are historical narrations. They're very similar to the Old Testament, the stories of David and Goliath, Ruth, Rebecca. It's reading the Puranic narrations. It kind of reminds me of reading the Old Testament. And it's there that we find mention of the hollow earth.
Interesting. I mean, these texts, obviously, they're, I guess, compared to Sumerian texts, are these considered to be older? Because we're talking 5,000 years, and that's just when they were written down. I mean, there might be an oral tradition that extends longer than that.
Yes, well, in the literature itself, what you see is that the Vedic society on Earth, which was once very much encompassing, it fragmented to Druid, to Indo-European, to various cultures that we know, that we think they're separate or similar, but they're ramifications, they're branch-offs. But yes, I would say, I don't see them as being older than the Sumerian. It's just that this knowledge is presented as something that's cyclical. Sometimes it's wiped off the face of the earth and is reestablished again. What we see in the literature is that they are shepherded by this demigod culture, by these celestials that sometimes appear within the society as great warriors or great teachers or great proponents of medical science, that kind of thing. So it's eternal. Probably you've heard of the Kalki avatar.
Mm-hmm.
So Kalki comes at the end of every yuga cycle, consisting of 4 yugas. Right now we're in the last one, the Kali Yuga. At that time the Kalki avatar will appear, and he will bring with him men from the inner earth to repopulate the surface world. So in this way it's cyclical. It may disappear for a while, the Vedic understandings, but they're manifested again. That's the idea. So when you talk about age, I mean, how can you talk about age when that's the ideal, that it's something cyclical that's manifested again and again?
Sure, that's definitely a fair point. And these texts, they kind of describe the earth and life and even humans much differently than we consider them today. Can you tell us about those aspects of the story?
Yes, but they describe it all in stride. You know, I mean, somebody might be reading, for example, the history of the American Revolution, and then as part of the reading, you'll hear about the Atlantic, and you'll hear about the British, and you'll hear about France, and, you know, the French fleet came, and this, that, and the other. Well, in the same way, you know, it's not, the point is not to describe these places. People knew about these places already. And in the same way, these Puranic texts, they describe narrations that have their own points, but as part of the storyline, the hollow cavity of the earth, the other side of the earth, is also described, because they're also involved with goings-on the surface, and vice versa. They go back and forth, just like we go back and forth across the Atlantic. So they're described, but they're described in that way. It's kind of in stride.
Yeah, kind of like it's just it's given knowledge. And that is interesting. But don't they talk about a cloud layer up in the sky that seems very different than the clouds we have now, right?
Well, this was the idea, and you can see it described in the Bible with this idea of 40 days rain and 40 nights of rain, that there was a cloud mantle around the earth, and that it protected the beings on the earth from the radiations from deep space, and allowed human beings to grow taller, to have better brains, better memories, quicker thinking, and to have greater longevity also. So this is one thing that was described in Vedic times, that there was a cloud mantle, but when the Dwapara Yuga came to an end and the Kali Yuga began, the cloud mantle disintegrated. The descriptions of the hollow earth and even cavern worlds are certainly there. Now, you mentioned the point that these texts have passed through, the hands of one translator to the other until they've reached us in modern times. And this brings up the idea that perhaps some changes were made to these texts, yes, and maybe some exaggeration or something like that. But I'll bring up an interesting point. Of these Puranas, there are 18 of them that are especially prominent. There is one which is a little bit different. It belongs to a certain community of Brahmins in India, and they've kept it up, let's say. They've maintained it well. What is said about this Purana is that it has no interpolations in it, that it's a closed book. It was written in Vedic times. It ended in Vedic times. It didn't continue. It wasn't updated. And specifically, it's written in that same Sanskrit of the Vedic era. And you don't find further comments, or as I say, these interpolations, which involved post-Vedic Sanskrit or much more recent Sanskrit. So what you find in the Bhagavad Purana is actually very genuine. The impression that everyone gets is that it's it's the real McCoy. It hasn't been touched. It hasn't been fooled with. It's written in the same script, that kind of thing. And it does mention these hollow earth narrations, these hollow earth pastimes. So that's kind of a control for us when we look at the work that other translators may or may not have done. So I was thinking I would bring that point up.
Yeah, that's definitely worth mentioning. I mean, can you tell us about some of these areas in the text where they do discuss interactions with other beings on the planet? And are those interactions, are they happening mainly around the times of massive Earth changes, the changing of the yugas, or popping up here and there, or is it more of a sustained relationship?
Well, I would like to jump into that part, but let me just make a comment on what you were saying, for example, about some of these exotic weapons that we see mentioned in Bhagavad Gita and other literature. What we see mentioned are arrows that seek and follow their prey, which remind us of missiles, guided missiles, heat-seeking missiles, for example. We're also exposed to the idea of UFOs, aircraft with UFO flight characteristics, the fantastic speeds of the UFOs and the way they stop on a dime and make right-angle turns and that kind of thing. We're also exposed to voice-activated weapons, voice-activated arrows with a mantra on them, which is programming, such that they will do what they were told. Mm-hmm. So when the British first went to India and started translating these texts, it was just, it was Looney Tunes for them. It was just some crazy, wild, unacceptable description of a culture and whatever, obviously. But nowadays we see these kinds of weapons, So all of a sudden it doesn't seem that far-fetched. And when we think about the Vedic culture and these Vedic descriptions of the hollow earth, let's keep in mind what the Vedic culture was. It was a culture that had a written language, which is much more sophisticated than our languages today, of which, let's say, Latin, German, the Indo-European languages were fragmentations. They were developed in terms of astronomy and calendar systems. They were developed in terms of mathematics, and we're talking about certainly algebra. So these are not just like the Yanomami Indians of Brazil that have some folk legend about the Hollow Earth or something like that. These were actually at least the Brahmin caste. They were very educated and had a lot of information and knowledge to their credit.
I know the farthest out aspect of this is the idea of the internal sun, and it's where a lot of people call bullshit because it seems so foreign to our understanding. But, you've explained it just now, and you explained it to me in a way the other day that made it seem more reasonable, that it's more like a loose collection of light particles that pass through the outer layers of the Earth and illuminate the inner cavity, rather than being a sun-like star or anything like that. And I guess what's weird is people just have to think about the idea of light particles passing through the Earth, which, it's outside of my expertise to know if that's rational or not, but I can visualize it. It seems to make sense.
Yeah, well, this is another obstacle to overcome, something that has to be understood. How do you get light within the crust and the cavern worlds? They're enclosed. And then you've got this hollow cavity, which is very big, but the openings are actually relatively small. I mean, they don't let in a lot of sunlight, not at all. So how do you get sunlight? How do you get heat and warmth, to make vegetation grow within the hollow earth? A hollow sun has been, stipulated, theorized, because it's been seen by explorers, Arctic explorers, who approached the pole. During the Arctic night, the explorer Nansen, for example, who was knighted by the King of Norway for his expedition in the 1890s, he made two very significant expeditions, and one of them had him graze the opening. And in the Arctic night, they saw the sun on the horizon, a copper-colored sun on the horizon, but it was on the wrong horizon. It was on the wrong side, and this was a couple of weeks or something like that before the actual sun of the solar system was supposed to rise anyway. So in the middle of the dark night, they're wondering, what is this doing here? How do we have this sun on the horizon in the wrong place?
Yeah.
So we know that we know there's a sun in there. That's the idea. But then what is the sun like? It's been described as being copper-colored. The idea that we have from the descriptions, take it or leave it, of Olaf Jansen, who was a young Norwegian boy in 1848, who actually made it in, let's say, with his father on their fishing sloop. Not a very big boat. There were only two of them. But he described the sun as being also copper-colored, as being kind of nebulous, and nebulous in the sense that it looked like an agglomeration of particles, and it didn't look like the sun of the solar system that has a very well-defined disk, a very well-defined edge to it. It wasn't like that. The edge was, it was an agglomeration of particles. What would be the idea here? What do we theorize? We theorize that electrons and all the particles that come from the sun, they're all electrons, they're all negatively charged, that they are composed in the ultimate issue of photons. They are photon aggregates. That's how we would describe electrons. This coming from a hollow earther named Joseph H. Cater, who he was more active in the 50s and 60s. He's elderly now.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean that aspect of it is super interesting, but I feel like we've done a pretty good job of explaining it, or mainly you. But let's go through some of these stories. I mean, you mentioned the expeditions in the Arctic, and I've heard you describe some pretty strange navigational behavior near the North Pole on some of those early expeditions to discover it, and you equate that to the false assumption that the Earth is a sphere, where in reality at the North and South Poles they sort of sink in like big punch bowls long before you get near the actual pole or the hollow earth entrance. Can you tell us about those early expeditions and that aspect to the Earth's geology?
Well, I can, but perhaps you'd give me just a few seconds to wrap up very quickly what I was actually driving at.
Sure.
With these particles that pass through the Earth. When they make it to the hollow portion, some of these particles, they get captured and they bounce around, they break up into their constituent photons, and that's how you have this omnipresent light that manifests in the hollow cavity. And they, in the ultimate issue, they congregate in the middle, and that's how the sun is formed. Maybe we should go to the outer surface then, and
sure.
Speak about the contour of the planet.
Yes.
So the idea that people have of the planet is that maybe it's like an egg on its side. The curvature of the Earth tends to flatten out until it becomes completely flat at the North and South poles. Mm-hmm. And this is true to a great degree, but if there is a hollow Earth with openings, then what we actually have is a basin. It's like an hourglass, which is thin at the neck, but the outer edges, the inward grade, the inward slope or angle, starts out very, how do you say, not very acutely, mm-hmm. and very slight, and then it becomes acuter as it gets closer to the neck of the opening, like an hourglass, and then it would mm-hmm. open up within until it takes on the contour of the inner surface. So this is very important. It has to do with navigation, because the Arctic explorers in the 1800s were always getting lost. They were always getting lost because they didn't know about their latitude, They were not on an outward sloping latitude. The whole Arctic basin is a basin. The whole Arctic Ocean is a basin. It's an inward sloping basin. So your grade is actually turned inward, such that when you use a sextant to calculate your position, you end up making some huge errors. Mm-hmm. And this showed up in the logbooks of Dr. Cook, who claimed he discovered the North Pole, but who was ridiculed because as he approached the pole, he spoke about making progress of something like 48 miles, 53 miles a day, and that was, of course, ridiculous across the Arctic ice. And then a few years later, Admiral Peary was awarded the honor of having discovered the North Pole, and his logbook made more ridiculous claims along the same lines. As he approached the pole, he was making speeds of up to 73 miles a day across the ice. So the admiral, he got the prize, and the doctor, he got ridiculed and treated very, very badly. But what makes this happen? You're going up a certain slope until you reach the outer rim, which the outer rim is actually flat. And then when you start edging downward and going inward, something happens. It's the same effect that you would have if you're in an auditorium which is dark, like in the movie theater, and you have the ushers with these flashlights in their hand. And when they flick their wrist, they can cover just a little bit of distance, but it gives the impression of having covered a large distance across the ceiling of the auditorium. So it's something like that. You travel a few miles, and the grade becomes very sharp. It goes from outward sloping to inward sloping. And when you project this against your celestial navigation, it seems like you just made 73 miles of progress that day. So this means that you're getting over the hump and you're really going down into the sharper angle of the hollow earth opening. But you don't realize it because all you see is flat land stretching out, all around you. But your navigation will tell you that you're getting close because the inward grade is getting steeper. This is one effect of the inward slope. People get lost and they report these speeds,
Right. That's a good explanation, because I think for me, when I first started hearing about the hollow earth, it was hard to visualize, to get a solid grasp on how those pole openings work, because I think the first thought would be that it's kind of like coming up to the edge of a massive cliff, and it's nothing like that. It's seems like almost like a big hill in the ocean, and you go up and then you start coming down the other side, almost like the momentum of a roller coaster.
Right.
Is that accurate?
I would go along with that. But to give you an idea of the slightness of the grade, at least in the beginning, right above Ellesmere Island. In fact, it must have been they were still on Ellesmere Island in Canada, which would have put them. This was who? This was Admiral. This was Admiral Peary. He wrote 4 years in the Arctic North, in the White North, something like that. But what he recorded as they were traveling northward, that there was foreshortening of the horizon, and he mentioned a mountain, he mentioned a hill. So he was not on the ice yet. He was still on Ellesmere. This puts him 500 miles away from the North Pole. And what he said was that they would see the tip of this mountain or this hill sticking up above the horizon in their binoculars. So they would say, okay, that's 9 miles away, the horizon, and they would head towards it, but they would arrive very quickly, like maybe after 6 miles. And this tells us that the slope, the angle of the curvature is already has a downward and inward slope to it. But by the time you get to the North Pole, I mean that's a very slight slope. It's not very sharp at all. No, it's not like a precipice. It's not like the edge of a cliff. It's in the area where all the Arctic anomalies have been noticed that indicate that we're close to an opening. Near the area where the polar explorers always noticed that the animals are migrating for the winter, but they're migrating northward. From that area where they say, well, the wind is blowing, but when it comes from the north during the winter, it's warmer. And then the ice on deck starts melting. From that area where the pollen clouds come blowing across the entire ice scape and cover the entire surface with pollen, this orangish pollen, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we think the opening is, and that's where we see this whitish disk. So that's fairly good evidence right there.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I like that it's able to be backed up by some of those satellite images. It's super interesting and contradictory to everything I've ever been taught. But we've kind of bogged the people down with science and the knowledge of the ancient texts, and we're about at the halfway point of what we were going to do here. Let's look at some of the stories, the massive amount of anecdotal evidence that the Earth is different, especially around those pole areas. I think a lot of them are a good place to start. They come out of what's typically known as the age of exploration. When Europe got their ships out there, the 1400s, 1500s. Is that when we start to see these stories coming out?
Well, apparently the Eskimos always had contact with the Scandinavians, and their folklore told about the world where it's always illuminated and there's no darkness. Because that's another aspect to the hollow earth. I mean, it's you're not going to have darkness down there. So that's a separate issue. But they had their folklore, their information about this world because they were inhabitants of the Arctic Basin, so they knew what was up there. And the Scandinavians, they've always had their folklore going back, this is before the Christian era at least, talking about their gods, their demigods, Thor, who is Jupiter, the land of Thor, where the people are giants and where the sun never sets, and the land where there's no horizon. So these concepts were always known to them even way back then. So that's one point of reference. Another point of reference would be Leif Erikson, because he founded that colony in Greenland right at the turn of the millennium, at the end of the 900s, you might recall. And that was a colony that flourished very much so because of the support that came from Europe. They sent a boat or two every year to bring supplies and things people couldn't manufacture. And that colony went on for years. Now, the bubonic plague beset Europe in something like the late 1200s, and they were not able to maintain contact with their colony in Greenland anymore. This was between Greenland and North America. It was on that side of Greenland, the colony. And in the meantime, the Scandinavians had passed the control of the colony to the Danes, because the Danes were a bigger, wealthier, or more populated country, and they could handle the expenses. So they stepped up and took over by that time. But the contact was lost, and something like a couple hundred years went by. And then just like maybe 50 years before the Columbus discovery, people started to wonder, well, whatever happened to this colony? We left these people there. There were hundreds of people there. What if they flourished? What if they're still alive? What if they still speak their Norse language? We have a Christian duty and that kind of thing. And they sent a ship. And the ship found the remains of the colony. And they were able to communicate with the Eskimos and ask what happened. And the Eskimos told them that the Vikings ended up trekking up towards the north across the Arctic ice to the inner world where it's always illuminated and the sun never sets and all that. So that's another point of reference. Even from before Columbus, they were coming back and saying, well, they went into the Hollow Earth,
Yeah, that's crazy. And you mentioned Scandinavia, which, of course, I've heard you talk about the origins of the Santa Claus story, which come from that region. And there's a tie-in to the Inner Earth, possibly. Would you like to tell that anecdote?
Well, yeah, that's very interesting. The Santa Claus folklore. The idea is that this holy person comes with elf-like creatures. I mean, who knows? Maybe they were Eskimo helpers or maybe actual elves. But he came from the inner earth, from the north, and he was a great mystic. He was a holy man and a great mystic, and he would come on this huge sleigh, and he would bring supplies and food and things to help the people during the winter. And he, like any holy man, I guess he lived for others and believed in charity and that kind of thing, and he helped the people. And this is one of their myths, and this was the whole beginning of the Santa Claus myth. That Santa Claus came from the inner earth. Amazing.
Yeah, it is funny when you tie it into that. But now, if we
how about the Smithsonian Institute? That's all Hollow Earth right there. It was founded by Smithson, a Scotsman, who after the Revolution bequeathed a great fortune to the establishment of these museums and also a sum of money to fund an expedition to go to the Arctic and find the opening to the hollow earth, to explore it inside and to bring back examples of its fauna and vegetation, and to display them in this museum that was built. And that was the first museum, the original Smithsonian Museum. So the whole Smithsonian Museum was built in order to showcase the findings from the hollow earth when they got back from their expedition. Can you believe that one?
Richard Dewhurst, he wrote this book about the Smithsonian's cover-up of any artifacts that come through about giants. They seem to take them in, but they never reach display. They always seem to get lost, and they seem to go missing or become hidden. And that's interesting because these giants are thought of to possibly have come from the inner earth. We hear stories about them in various ancient texts, and there's plenty of myths about giants, but apparently that's where they might have came from.
Yes, and not only the cavity, but also from cavern worlds. These giant human beings, they've been seen in other parts of the world. Who was it? Captain Cook, not Dr. Cook, but Captain Cook, the English explorer. He ran across one of these giant people. I think that they're supposed to have been 8-9 feet tall, a tribe that was living in the Andes Mountains. But down there in Patagonia, he was able to actually capture one of them. And but the person jumped off the ship in the middle of the ocean when they were taking, after they had already put to sea. And who knows what happened to him, but they couldn't recover him. So that's one example. And then we have the Amazon warriors that were encountered by the Spanish expedition headed up by Orellana. And I've really looked into that one, and it's very much for real. They had a chronicler with them. They had a church friar with them who, had studied and who was literate and whatever. And he was writing down a report, keeping a log of the whole expedition. Sensible man, educated man, religious man, not apt to tell lies, we wouldn't think. And they had to battle their way as their two boats went down the Amazon River from the Peruvian headwaters towards the Atlantic. And around the middle, let's say, they encountered, this would be near the city of Santarém in Brazil. If you look on a good map, you'll see that city along the Amazon River, a little bit above Santarém. They encountered, they became engulfed in this battle with Indians, an Indian tribe, and there were many of these Amazon ladies among the Indians, and they were the ones marshaling the battle and giving the orders and running the whole show. And they were described as being very muscular. They were much more muscular than their Indian counterparts, and they were described as being a palm taller than the tallest Spaniard. That's for those times. Mm-hmm. But a palm would be something like 8 inches. So 8 inches taller than the tallest of their people on their expedition. There were 50 of them. So you can imagine these ladies, they were, maybe from the shoulder. People would come up to their shoulders maybe, or maybe just to just below the neck, just below the shoulders. That's also possible. Yeah. So and they are described, they are related to cavern worlds, the Amazon warriors, these lady warriors, the female warriors. You may not realize it, but Christopher Columbus on the island of Guadalupe, he was told by the Indians that there were lady warriors that lived in the caverns inside the earth, and they would come out sometimes and battle and kill and take hostages and things like that.
Whoa.
So they seem to have had their underground aspect too. Because you don't find them; they disappeared.
Yeah, interesting. So let me bring us back to this era of exploration a bit, in the 1500s and that kind of era, it seems like if there were discoveries and an orchestrated effort made to keep information from the public, because clearly, the powers that be, the shadowy elites that run the planet, they have to know this information and keep it hidden. And it seems like that would be the era where, at least among a certain level of leaders, it seems that that's where that concerted effort would start to happen. I mean, are there any stories from that time that jive with that idea?
Well, there was Sir Martin Frobisher during the times when Elizabeth and Drake were terrorizing the seas, and Frobisher was one of them. He was one of her sea captains right up there with Drake. He was commissioned to go to the Arctic and to explore the Arctic shores. And he was given a map, the Frobisher map, which shows the Arctic shores, basically, but it shows some inner shores. And the idea you get is that the person was passing through the opening, and then when you pass through the opening, what you see around you, because, you're coming through a hole and then it opens up down below, and what you see around you was the other coastline. There was another coastline shown in the map.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's that. And then there was Henry Cabot, another explorer who was searching for the Northwest Passage. Well, he disappeared, but supposedly he was poking up there. And then when they were searching for the lost Franklin expedition around 1850, all of the explorers, especially the military rescuers, especially the military ones, were warned about not going up above and across the Arctic. They didn't want them to go poking around up there. There might be some reason for that, but certainly when you get to the explorer, I just mentioned his Nansen, a Norwegian. I mean, he wrote down everything that says hollow earth, hollow earth, hollow earth. Here's the opening. But he didn't come out and say a hollow world, His ship came very close to the opening. And as I mentioned, they were the ones that reported all of these warm temperatures. They were the ones that found mammal life in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Not even once they came close to Greenland, but on the other side of the opening. When they were really in the middle of the Arctic, and there was no food chain for these mammals. They came across, what do you call them, wolves. They came across wolves. They came across very large hare, rabbits, and also land birds, also seals, and these things are not supposed to exist in the middle of a frozen ocean during the winter, of all things. And I've mentioned already some of the anomalies that he found, but just to give you an idea of how dramatic it was, there was one point where he separated from the ship on a sled with dogs. He and he and one of the crew members, and they went towards the North Pole. They wanted to conquer the North Pole. But the ice was there were ridges, ice ridges, and they couldn't make it, and they had to turn back. But this was in this was in April. Now April, let's say 100 miles from the North Pole, is very frigid. I mean, the temperatures are supposed to be so cold. 20 degrees below zero. I mean, those are the typical temperatures. I mean, even in April, don't think that because it's April, it warms up. It doesn't warm up until maybe July, a little bit before July and a little bit into August, and that's all there is. And then it starts very quickly getting cold again. But what Nansen said is that he couldn't get to sleep at night, and they were having trouble with their sleep typically because the temperatures were too hot. And he mentioned that during the day we set up a tent and we got underneath the shade because we were being scorched by the heat of the sun.
Wow, that's not what you would think would happen up in the Arctic Circle.
No, it's not. And then there was Perry again, who at the very top of Greenland was reporting temperatures of 50 degrees and a warm wind coming from the North Pole in February. Now that's the worst month of winter. And he was very close. I mean, he was at the top of Greenland. He was only a few hundred miles away. Now, that's impossible. At his base camp, which he was 200 miles away from his base camp was Toul, where they have the Air Force Base now. They reported temperatures on the same days, which were not 50 degrees, but way below zero.
Man, yeah, that's interesting. So I guess let's fast forward. Let's bring it up to Olav Jansen, which was in the 1800s.
1800s, right?
He seems to be. This is like where the majority of the information about the inner Earth seems to come from. He seems to be one of the few people who's gotten in and gotten out and told the tale. Right? You mentioned him a little bit earlier, but let's get into the meat of what he saw down there, what he described, because it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, Olaf Jansen, I mean, his father took the boy on a fishing expedition. They went to Spitsbergen, they went to Franz Josef Islands, and let's say from Iceland and then over towards the actual above Russia, you know. They went laterally. And then he told his boy, let's go to the land of the Norwegian gods. Let's go to the land of Thor. Let's go check it out. I guess his father was a little eccentric, you know, and I don't know what kind of fits the boy's mother was going through when they disappeared, but they went across towards Siberia, and he also reported the warm winds, and he reported this mock sun being, off the bow, while at the same time they were seeing the sun of the solar system off of their stern. And that the further they would go, it seemed like the higher up the sun of the inner Earth rose, while the sun of the solar system was falling below the horizon. In other words, they were nosing inwards. And they finally made it in, and they described a Mediterranean climate, and that they sailed along for a while, a few days, and they came across a ship. And it seemed to be some kind of tourist ship, and the people were singing songs, and it was the hugest ship that you could ever imagine. I mean, for him in those days, who knows? Perhaps nowadays we have ships that would be similar in size. But they were discovered by this ship on their little sloop, and very quickly let's say a type of captain's launch or something like that, or a lifeboat or whatever, was launched by the ship with no apparent ropes or anything like that. It was just lowered, and it very quickly approached them, and the people were giants, and they had beards, and they were very friendly, and they made nice offers for the two Norwegians to come with them on their boat and go back to the ship. So they jumped off of their fishing sloop and went with these people. And they quickly went back to the boat, and they were brought up, and there they were on deck, surrounded by these Hollow Earthers. And the Hollow Earthers were the same race as they were, the same as the Scandinavians.
Nordic looking. We can see the Nordics and the Russians as being maybe spillage or offshoots or wanderers from the Hollow Earth that lived in the Arctic shores perhaps before the cloud mantle fell, and it just became separated from their homeland. But these people were Nordic looking. They spoke a language which Olaf Jansen said he later on realized was very close to Sanskrit. He said that his father, who was 6 foot something, 6'4", 6'6", only came up to the belt buckle of the shortest of them. Oh my God.
Yeah. He said that they were very elegant and they had ease of manners and grace that only comes with good breeding. And he was treated very nicely. He mentioned trees. He was taken on tours. He mentioned trees that would dwarf the redwoods of California. He mentioned mammoth that also would dwarf the elephants of the surface. He mentioned that an apple was the size of a man's head. He mentioned that a bunch of grapes was as tall as a man. I think he means a man of the surface. That the fruit was much sweeter tasting. That the seeds were smaller. And he was even taken to see the king or the emperor of one of them. And they were treated very nicely. Their ship was filled with, or their boat was filled with gold, and after 2 years they decided to go back to their destiny and their world on the surface. He tried to go northwards. They had some problem with the winds working against them. It was the wrong season. You know, the earth breathes. So they decided to just follow the wind down the southern side and come out that way. And that they sailed out of the Arctic Ocean and sailed into the Indian Ocean. This suggests that actually, although it's covered with ice, that Antarctica does have a channel going through it, or did. And at any rate, their ship had a problem on the Indian Ocean. They were still very close to Antarctica, and especially since it was too weighty with gold. And the ship sank. It went plop, and it sank. And his father was quickly drowned. His father was below decks or something like that, and the ship sank like a gold weight. I'm not going to say like a lead weight. And he was lucky enough to make it to one of the icebergs. They were sailing through icebergs. And about 2-3 hours later, he saw a whaler ship, and he was picked up by the whaler and taken home. And he was seen as being rather crazy and had some problems. But
wow,
that's his story.
That's interesting, man. That's those detailed accounts of the fruit and the beans. That's pretty interesting to me. I guess one of the most famous accounts, anyone who's heard of the Hollow Earth has probably heard of the Admiral Byrd story.
There are contradictions, and they haven't been explained very well. So,
what did his expedition find? Were there any interesting details about the inner world or anything?
I can tell you the only things I've heard, and I didn't tell you this before, but the one I got this from was my father.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my father was, he joined the Navy in 1936. He's an original plank owner, original member of the cruiser Brooklyn. And after World War II, of course, he was still in the Navy. He stayed in until 1956. And he was on that expedition. And the way this came to my attention is that during the Barry Goldwater campaign, I was just a little boy, and Johnson was running these ads against him where it showed this big nuclear mushroom cloud, and it depicted Goldwater as being irresponsible or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mother and father were talking about Armageddon and what could destroy the world, and he was talking. He brought up this expedition, and she always got on. She got on. This was the first time. I was really about 8 years old. I remember the house we were living in then, and she got on him about how, there you go again with that stuff, that you were on the Bennington. But when you got back to Australia or something like that, you wrote me a letter and you said you were on the Philippine Sea. So, and then you always said that you were on the Philippine Sea, and later on you did a tour on the Bennington. And he was swearing that, no, I only served on the Bennington. I was on the Bennington twice. And she would say, well, I wish I had kept that letter. I don't know why you keep saying that. And I don't know why, but he didn't want to say that he was on the Philippine Sea, which is the one that went down there. But he told her at this time when we were watching this commercial on television, it was in the afternoon. I remember everything that happened that day. And he told her that the pilots, they went down there and they investigated, and they flew because there were reports of Nazi UFOs down there, or flying saucers, or some weird contraptions like that. And they got jumped, and we lost a few aircraft, and they came limping home, and they landed, on the deck, and we had to hightail it out of there. And I remember him telling her, she was trying to ask, well, what was it? What did they find? And he was saying, well, it was sort of a depression that they're in. They're in a depression there, and that's where they were staying. And he didn't have any exact information because, come on, he was a chief petty officer. They didn't tell him about it, But there was scuttlebutt on the ships, and that's all anybody knows about, that these aircraft went down there, and a lot of aircraft, and they were encountered by UFOs. They were treated abruptly. They opened fire or something like that. There were exchanges, and they really got whipped. Lost aircraft.
And see, I guess the prevailing theory is that these were Nazi crafts. I know there's a lot of weird occult themes and strange technology that surround the Nazis, and they took a lot of interest in the poles. Some even think Hitler did escape to Antarctica. Do you think they were aware of the inner Earth?
Well, it's funny. They sent the expedition to the African side, New Schwabenland. There were 2 or 3 large ships, and they did have a couple of seaplanes with them, and they did do a lot of exploring, but they were on the wrong side. They were exploring because they were looking for the entrance to the Hollow Earth. Exactly.
This idea, if this is true and all the forms we're discussing, you realize this would be the mother of all conspiracies, right? This would be one of the ultimate secrets to have kept all these years, right?
Well, I think that there's a worldwide conspiracy much wider and just much more far-reaching than anybody could possibly fathom. It's kind of hard to just come out and tell people whether the source of our civilization is actually from the hollow world and we've broken away and that's our homeland, and things like that. They would lose control, and all of the people from the surface can't go there anyway. And I don't know. What are they supposed to do? Of course they're not telling us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually have thought about the idea, well, it's clear the way the rulers rule is through fear and propaganda and misinformation. And it's interesting when I think back to a time when people thought the world was flat, when they thought the earth was flat, and the big scare was, oh, you don't want to venture too far from home, you might fall off the earth. And that just seems like a story you would tell someone that you wanted to keep under control. I wonder if the leaders really believed the earth was flat, or if that's just something they were able to propagandize to keep a better thumb, to keep everybody under their thumb. And maybe the secrets of a hollow earth is just that to another level. But with technology expanding to the everyman, it seems harder to keep a lid on this. Are there any stories of a concerted effort to cap some of these holes to the cavern worlds, or collapse some of these tunnels so that people can't access them?
Now, about attempts to cap the openings to cavern worlds, which the cavern worlds theme interests me very much because it's right where we are. You don't have to travel across 2,000 miles of frozen Arctic wasteland in northern Canada and all that, and carry your fuel with you and food and survive the elements to get to where these cavern worlds are.
Right.
They're everywhere, and it's not just in the jungles of the Amazon. They're in North America. They're everywhere. For example, the Apache Indians were known for escaping through tunnels. They only fought one pitched battle with the cavalry. They would spring raids on the cavalry, usually from the mountains, from above, while the cavalry's in a canyon or something like that. And then they would run off through these tunnels and caves, and the cavalry would never catch up with them. And they would show up like on the other side of the border in Mexico 2 weeks later, something like that. And nobody saw them traveling across land. So this is very interesting. Now, right where the Apaches had their chief activity, where they were the most active, where they defended the most, and especially one area where they fought a pitched battle to keep the cavalry away, which is close to the Panamint Mountains, if I'm not mistaken. It's up there near Area 51. And it is an area where there are reports of tunnel entrances and steps, cut steps into the rocks, and auditorium-sized rooms that opened up. But what went on during the early 70s, right in that area, something like, according to David Hatcher Childress, 25 miles from where the Apaches were most active, were the underground atomic explosions. So if there were cavern worlds in this area, and there were, the world of the Apaches or something like that was actually below the surface of the earth, or some cavern world was down there, at one point, we just weren't able to make peace with them or subjugate with them, and they did these underground atomic explosions. And the Russians did a few too. And in the Hindu Kush, which is known, that's where you have the most folklore about underground worlds, Shangri-La and that kind of thing. The Pakistanis engaged in some underground nuclear testing also. So all these people are enemies with each other, but they seem to have a common agenda, and they don't tell on each other. There's winks and nods. And again, the size and scope of the conspiracy is just still something that I cannot fathom.
Yeah, man. It drives me nuts.